All right, our next speaker in the session is Emma Beecham, who's going to talk about listening to children's concerns and fears around living, and she's going to touch on aspects of quality of life. Emma is a research fellow at the Louis Dundas Centre at Great Ormond Street in London. She has a master's in psychology, and she's told me before the session that she's just handed in her PhD, so well done, Emma. And this is one of the first times she's going to be speaking about some of her findings, and she tells me this is a practice session for her Viva, so please be very kind and gentle on her. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organising committee for inviting me to speak here today. So as Michelle said, my name is Emma Beecham, and I'm a researcher from the Louis Dundas Centre back in London. So today I'm going to talk about listening, listening to children's fears and concerns of living, quality of life, through my work on children and young people's participation in consultations with paediatric oncologists, an analysis of on-the-ground interactions. Sorry, I've got my high heels on as well. So to give a bit of background on the study, most research undertaken in the area of quality of life to date has really focused on more of a quantitative measuring of quality of life. And this has really resulted in a gap in the academic and clinical knowledge base regarding the perspectives of what quality of life actually means to families and healthcare professionals. And recently, a number of paediatric studies, including our own systematic review, as seen here on the slide, on children with brain tumours, report that to families, quality of life in a health context is a subjective phenomenon and involves an individual striving for something Debbie Braybook was talking about yesterday, normality. So striving for normality or a new normal. However, previous studies in the main have been retrospective and interview studies which are really only conducted at single points in the illness trajectory. And our own systematic review concluded that prospective, observational, longitudinal research is needed to understand the subjective experiences and how they really change over time. With quality of life accepted in the literature as a subjective concept, it's important that the child's own views and perspectives are taken into consideration. Children's participation in clinical consultations has been identified as an important aspect of their care and treatment. And policies at the turn of the century calling for inclusion of the child in the decision-making about their own care and treatment have also made understanding the child's perspective that bit more pressing. However, this guidance is quite abstract and with kind of limited specific recommendations for conducting actual consultations. And further, there's a lack of consensus in the literature as to what child participation involves, or what form it takes, or what form it should take. And much of the previous research really stresses the lack of involvement of children in the consultation. So several recent studies have questioned previous understandings of participation and have proposed changes in how children's participation should be understood going forward. So simplistic, literal approaches to identifying the child's voice or views were found really to miss the child's point of view, and with it, the contribution of their quality of life concerns. So more recent studies have used different approaches and methods to the study of children's participation, and in these studies, the focus is on the actual on-the-ground interactions as they unfold. Data used for the exploration of quality of life is taken from a 20-month longitudinal prospective ethnographic study following 19 families from diagnosis through to death in some instances in interactions in the hospital and at home among children and young people with a high-risk brain tumour, their families and clinicians. So these 19 families had a range of diagnoses, ages, languages and religions, and really represented around 50% of the high-risk brain tumours seen in the UK over the study period. So consultations in the study were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim, which provided hundreds of transcripts of consultations conducted in the home and the hospital to explore. To explore quality of life in the data, a flexible approach was needed that really respected that quality of life may mean different things to different people, it being a subjective phenomenon. So quality of life dimensions were developed. Dimensions were developed deductively from our systematic review and inductively from the data itself. So see the figure here on the slide for the 11 quality of life dimensions that we developed. So searching for these quality of life dimensions using word searches in the data within NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis software, resulted in quality of life excerpts. And taking an interactionist perspective, participation in these quality of life discussions or excerpts was explored as a triadic process. So by this, I mean we looked at the child, the parents, and the clinician in the consultations. And consistent with recent literature, a wide approach to participation was taken that included non-verbal, as Anna was just highlighting too, as well as verbal language. To demonstrate our approach and our findings, I will focus on a single case that revealed the range of kinds of participation by children. So Alia, not her real name, was a 14-year-old girl from the UAE with a high-grade glioma that had progressed twice at the point of study entry. Alia's family were in the UK seeking possible further treatment, and Alia attended every consultation with her mother, who had very limited English and so only spoke in Arabic throughout the consultations. Her father attended when he wasn't back at home looking after Alia's siblings, and he and Alia both spoke English. And it's worth noting that Alia actually attended a school in the UK whilst she was here receiving treatment. So to explore participation within the quality of life excerpts, a code book was developed. So again, inductively from the data and deductively from the literature, to interrogate the data and understand how the child participated in the consultation within these quality of life discussions. So you see here an entry from the code book. I don't know if you can see that very well. The code book was developed, piloted, revised, agreed, and then used by 3 researchers. And the process of coding for participation codes was again managed using NVivo. So this process resulted now in participation excerpts within the quality of life discussions. And here's an example of an excerpt where the child has acted as a translator for her mother and as such been coded as child as translator. And finally, analysis used constant comparison as well as principles of conversation analysis and principles and practices of discourse analysis to really understand and identify patterns occurring within the data set. So the quality of life dimensions which featured most prominently in Alia's case were school and peer relations, which were the most frequently discussed, and then the effects of treatment quality of life dimension. So as participation was approached as a triadic process, I will give an overview of the results as related to the 3 participant groups, so the child, then the clinicians, then the parents. So firstly, I will discuss some key results related to the child. So analysis of 77 quality of life excerpts from 23 different consultations between Alia, her parents and clinicians revealed the various ways that Alia participated in the consultations, including responding verbally to the clinician, initiating her own comments and questions regarding her own condition and options for care and treatment, as well as decisions. And in addition, Alia often translated for her mother and importantly signalled non-verbally with a glance or a move of the head for the clinician or the parent to speak on her behalf. Okay, so this is excerpt A. It is an example of Alia joining in the conversation on the effects of treatment dimension unprompted. So most of the conversation, as you can see, is between the father and the clinician, talking about Alia in the third person, even though she is in the room, in lines 1 to 9. The father says, the worry is in the future if this started to, appear again. And the consultant explains that to give her the chemo drug, Alia's neutrophils need to be healthy and they are currently at 1. And the chemo would make her sick if given with her neutrophils at 1. The father then speaks in Arabic in lines 10 to 11, which is unclear whether the recipient is Alia, her mother, or both. But then Alia joins in the conversation in line 12, uninvited by the clinician, to state that she has had the drug before, kind of indirectly implying, so why not again? To which the clinician then speaks directly to Alia to answer this implicit question and explain why she cannot have the treatment again. I know, but your count is so fragile. So Alia has brought herself into the conversation when she wants to, even with her father present, whom she usually depends upon to advocate for her. The clinician's behaviour indicated a lot of child-centred behaviour. So clinicians involved Alia in many ways, including directing information to Alia, even when the ongoing dialogue was mainly between the clinician and the father, asking Alia questions and regularly checking in to see if she was following and understood, encouraging Alia's parents not to speak for her, and actually, at one point, having the parents leave the room to see if Alia wanted to talk about anything without her parents present. And finally, advocating for Alia when she was not verbally involved in the conversation. So by advocating for Alia, Alia's impact continues even when she is not involved in the conversation, as demonstrated by the following excerpt. So the oncology consultant asks, how long are the exams going to be? And the father answers, she finished the exams, the last day of school is 24th of June. To which the oncologist responds, okay, so I would suggest that I get one of you here in 2 weeks' time to go through practical issues, consent and appointments, and the appointments start the moment she comes back from her exams, if this is important to you, which I think it is. So the clinician advocates for Alia by prioritising her views in the decision when she is not verbalising her views herself. So parents also demonstrated child-centred behaviours, and her father brings up school even when Alia doesn't. So for example, when her father asks the clinician if Alia can continue her studies during her treatment, and then aware of how important school attendance is to Alia, the consultant responds, absolutely, there is no point otherwise. So Alia's father tries to draw Alia into the conversation and encourages Alia to speak for herself. Parents relay Alia's priorities and continue to present and advocate Alia's views, even though they themselves acknowledge that their own priorities differ from hers, as demonstrated in her father's statement here. My view is that her treatment is more important than study. This is my view. But Alia, I know she's always conscious about study. Okay, so now let's look at an example of how parents demonstrate child-centred behaviour in more detail. So here is extract B. It's an example of the father advocating for Alia's wishes. So here in excerpt B, Alia is very hesitant to the clinician's questions about school and exams, and the clinician appears to suspect something is wrong, asking, not happy, in line 8. The father then displays child-centred behaviour by trying to encourage Alia to speak, as seen in line 9 here. The oncology consultant also displays child-centred behaviour by trying to assist Alia, asking her another question, but this time offering 2 different options for Alia to choose from in lines 10 to 11, which Alia then chooses, answering, I am not as in happy, and there is a pause, as Anne and Melissa and many people have talked about in the conference so far, the importance of silences, and the father was really listening to the space and really indirectly giving the father kind of an indirect permission to continue for her. So the father, observing that Alia isn't going to elaborate, then expands and explains the problem to the clinician in lines 15 to 17, and the conversation continued between the clinician and the father. So from Alia's limited response to her father's encouragement, Alia is really permitting her father to speak on her behalf. So really, excerpts A and B demonstrate the ways that Alia can choose to speak for herself or permit someone to speak for her. To conclude, a more positive and nuanced portrayal of child participation may unfold when using observational methods of data collection and wider definitions of participation. The family members impacted on the child's participation. So the child's voice did not actually emerge when isolated from her parents, and it took many different forms. So on her own with the clinician, Alia was less involved in the decision-making and only spoke when she was questioned and was prompted to speak, so really highlighting the importance of accompanying children to listen to their concerns and fears, as the title of these plenary talks suggest. With her mother and the clinician present, Alia contributed in different ways. She became more verbal, she asked more questions, and acted as a translator for her mother. With the father present, Alia had fewer verbal contributions. However, the father advocated for his daughter even when his perspective was different to hers. So the family really worked together to try and balance all their needs and co-produce the child's perspective to and with the clinician. And finally, a closer attention needs to be given to the consultation as it unfolds and the role of the participants in shaping the child's responses and involvement. And this is essential for writing specific guidance for involving the child in consultations and in decision-making. There are some clinical implications to emerge from this study. So communication training, I think it's been talked about a lot in the conference so far as well. Training is really needed to support clinicians to manage these incredibly difficult consultations and conversations. Simulation-based communication training could incorporate findings on the child's participation found in the literature and findings on the study of how participation can best be facilitated. And these could include, so how to manage a triadic interaction. I thought this was brilliantly shown with the winner of the short video on the first day, with how even within a family there can be different communication dynamics going on. But also, so the consequences of these differing views and how they can arise, and looking at the different stages or periods in the illness trajectory and how views can change at different points. So facilitators of the training could run through real examples of how the clinician can juggle these varying priorities and how best to accompany children in the consultation to make them feel most at ease and more likely to feel able to participate when and how they want. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, so Richard Langner, Darren Hargrave, and Myra Blueborn-Langner. I'd like to acknowledge the Louis Dundas Centre, the Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, Marie Curie, the True Colours Trust, Gosh Children's Charity, and the Health Foundation, all who directly or indirectly funded this study. And I'd like to thank the families and the clinicians who generously gave their time to participate in this study. And thanks for listening. Thank you.